This is AQA Psychology, and this is Psychodynamic Explanations of Gender Development. We've already looked in a separate video at what the psychodynamic explanation is, and in this video we're going to look at the evaluation. Okay, so first of all, let's focus in on Little Hans, which was Freud's evidence presented to back up his theory of the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. So the case study of Little Hans does support elements of the theory, as we saw in our last video. However, there's serious questions to be asked about it. It's primarily secondary data. Much of the data was collected not from Freud himself observing Little Hans, but all related to him by Little Hans's father, who wrote to him in a series of letters. Freud did meet Little Hans, but most of the data was actually gathered by Little Hans's father. So, as we know, that may lead to various issues such as subjective interpretation, which is another problem. Little Hans's father was an avid supporter of Freud's theories, and if you actually read the case study where Freud reported on this, you can tell this in things that the father and the mother say to Little Hans. It's clear that they really thoroughly subscribe to the psychodynamic view. Things like his mother, Little Hans's mother, warning him that if he touches his penis again, he'll have it chopped off, and things like that. His parents are clearly really strong subscribers to Freud's point of view, and therefore they can be interpreting things according to their own point of view, subjectively, and then passing them on to Freud, and not reporting things that don't fit, and so on. So there's a really big problem there. Equally, it's a case study, so we can't necessarily generalise from Little Hans being brought up by this particular set of parents to other males, let alone generalising to the Electra complex and to females. So that's another really big problem. And equally, there's no real evidence that this relates to his gender identity. You can sort of see the elements of it fit with Freud's Oedipus complex, but it doesn't necessarily show that that's how he's constructing his gender identity. Okay, contradictory evidence then. If we look at single-parent families, children in those families don't show abnormal gender development. You would expect, because of the way that the Oedipus complex is the theory of the Oedipus complex, that if gender is constructed based on this interaction with the mother and father, you would expect children in single-parent families to have abnormal gender development, and research shows that they don't. Nor do children of gay or transgender parents. So that's a really big contradictory evidence to this particular theory, because if it was true, you would expect to see those children having some kind of gender issue because they're not able to go through that process of identification and internalisation. However, they still are able to develop, to go through normal gender development. Right. It's an androcentric theory is the next problem. So it's really male-oriented theory. It's written by a male. It's really focused on the Oedipus complex. Actually, Freud himself admitted he didn't understand much about females. The Electra complex was almost an afterthought, and actually the name was thought up by someone else, Carl Jung, and some of the details added. So the Electra complex is assumed to be like an inferior version of the male norm, that actually female development is driven by a girl's desire to be more like a man. This whole theory is really, really male-oriented, male-centred. Male is viewed as normal and better. So that's a really big problem with this theory. Also, it lacks face validity is a really big problem. So, according to this theory, at the end of the phallic period, gender identity ought to emerge all at once. It says that actually a gender identity wouldn't be emerging before that point, because you're still going through all of this conflict and trying to resolve this conflict, and it's only once identification and internalization is taking place that gender identity will emerge and develop. But actually, we know that's not the case, because many studies have shown gender identity emerging much earlier than the age of 6, and actually also not that it emerges all at once necessarily, but that it's more of a gradual process. Many different studies have shown us that. So that's a really big problem with this theory, because actually basic gender identity begins at around the age of 2. Identifying their children are able to say whether they're a boy or a girl, and identify whether others are, and identify things that fit with this. And also after the age of 6, it's not just suddenly complete. More and more complexity and flexibility to the idea of gender is being added. If you think back to gender schema theory, that's a really good example of that. So this theory really does lack face validity in that sense. Equally, it's unscientific. It's impossible to measure many of the things that Freud talks about. The sexual drive, libido, the Electra complex, the Oedipus complex, id, superego, ego. It's not possible to measure any of those things, or really to examine them. The only evidence that he's put forward for it is Little Hans, which, as we've seen, is fraught with problems. So we can't get empirical proof. If we're talking about something that's in the unconscious mind, how can we ever get evidence of that? It's a theory that's not possible to falsify, and that's a really big problem, because you can't prove that it's true, you can't prove that it's false. So it could just be complete nonsense. So that's the end of the evaluation of the psychodynamic explanation.